everyone. Welcome back to Neuro Talks. So sorry for the slight delay. We had a bit of technical difficulties, but now we are back online, and I have here with me Professor Karina Nielsen, all the way from the UK. So Karina, to our LinkedIn Live today.
To be here. I'm really excited about this invitation and really happy to be talking about organizational intervention.
Wonderful. So Professor Karina, she is a professor of work psychology at the Sheffield University School in the UK. And Professor Nielsen's interests really focus around how we can create work environments to help us thrive better at work. And specifically, she looks at organizational interventions. So these interventions aim at improving employee well-being through making changes to the way that workplaces are organized, designed, and managed. And so she really looks into what makes these interventions work, which I think is a fundamental question that we all have at the back of our minds. So Karina, we talk a lot in these slides, about the well-being problem existing in workplaces, and people are always asking in the chat or to our speakers about solutions. So what do we actually do about this problem? And of course, there are general solutions related to training, improving social support, treating employees more like humans, things like that. But what I love about your research is that you really dive deep into the solutions to find out what works and what doesn't work as well. And so we'll definitely dive into your take on what works and doesn't. But to start us off, I want to give our listeners a bit of background into the world of intervention. So I wanted to ask you, I know there are two types of interventions to improve well-being. There are more individual interventions and organizational interventions. Could you explain the difference between the two and talk about what got you interested in organizational interventions specifically?
Yeah, so that's kind of a traditional. Individual interventions are focused on the individual. So how can the individual think, behave at work? And we assume that's going to change or that well-being. And it's focused on the individual. It can either focus on developing their resources, making them cope better with the job. On the other hand, you've got organizational intervention. So it's about changing the way work is organized, designed, and managed. So that's a way of dividing it. And quite often you'll see reviews where they pitch individual organizational interventions, saying which ones works the best. And I don't think that's helpful, because we're kind of comparing traditional individual level interventions and how they're evaluated. So what we do when we have an intervention is that we pick a group of people who've got a certain problem, then with that problem. So we've got a very targeted group. Another issue with individual interventions is that it's often evaluated a month after, and of course you're likely to find effects if you measure pretty quickly after. The still, thinking about it. The problem is we don't know how individual intervene. So do people still use what they've learned during an individual intervention 6 months? Does it actually really change anything? We don't know that. So I think that's one of the in terms of understanding individual level interventions. But comparing the two, as I said, it's comparing apples and oranges, because of interventions we look at, so what is actually going on in the workplace. People in a department, some will find that or feel that social support is, so that's why we do participatory intervention. So we take a participatory approach to what we ask employees. So what do you think are the main issues here? What are the issues for most people to perhaps increase social support if that's an issue for the majority of people? Rather than trying to look at individual level versus organizational level, what I'm trying to put in place is a systematic approach to addressing well-being in the workplace. A participatory approach where you engage employees and managers in identifying what are and how are we going to change them. But the actual activities at the individual level, it can be at the group level, so it can target into improving team climate, improving social support, which is kind of trying to improve. It can also be at the leader level, so we can also try to train leaders, health promoting leadership, that kind of thing. And then we have at the organizational level, you can changes to policies and work practices, trying to do work differently. So what I'm trying to research is, rather than looking at individual versus organizational, we actually look at what we call the ICLO, leader and organizational level. But the whole process of developing an interventional level has to be a structured process. So we develop intervention activities that work for the group in question, or for the department in question, for the organization.
Great. So you already gave some examples of organizational interventions that could include looking at structures, how we could make things like in terms of training for managers, things like that. So I was wondering then, how do you actually evaluate whether or not these interventions are successful? So what are some criteria? And yeah, what I know you read a lot. I read some of your papers on just your qualms with the current ways that people are evaluating interventions. So what are some of your thoughts about how interventions should really be measured in terms of success?
Yeah, so a way of evaluating interventions, be it individual, group leader, organizational level, has been control trial. And I don't know whether people are familiar with that term, but it's essentially you divide them randomly into an intervention group and a control group, and then you do something, and then you measure before and after. And if you then see an improvement in your intervention, hey, our intervention worked. But my argument is that that's like a black box. We do an intervention that brought about those changes. So what I'm focusing on is we need to understand. So did people participate in intervention activities? Were it of activities that were implemented? Do people feel they addressed the problems? And do we improve in working conditions? And as a result of that, improvement. So I'm suggesting different measures of evaluation. But we need a lot of data in between to understand. And that can be, for example, employees, with managers, how have they worked with the process? But it can also be questionnaires, asking specifically aspects of the intervention to understand, was the intervention implemented according to plan and the way we wanted it to work? If it isn't implemented according to plan, well, we can't really expect any well-being. And we know that it's a common problem that organizational interventions don't, because they weren't implemented the way they should have been. And that's why we kind of talk about two different kinds of failure. We talk about theory failure and failure, or implementation failure. So theory failure is if you go in and you try to implement something where the theory was simply wrong. If you look at the postal service, for example, if you want social support in the postal service, you might want to give postal workers the mobile phone so they can call each other and organize the route amongst themselves if somebody's running over. If you're in a shared office, giving people a mobile phone so they can call each other, that's not going to work. So that's a theory failure. That intervention is not likely to work. It won't achieve what you're trying to achieve. On the other hand, implementation failure is, but the intervention wasn't implemented according to plan. So for postal workers or postmen, a mobile phone, but you don't service, they can't actually call each other, then it's an implementation failure.
Yeah, and that makes me think about how you said success is really dependent on the individual context of the organization, and whether or not, for example, a manager is actually motivated to implement the change. I think is one important factor in whether or not the intervention is successful. And so I wanted to ask a question related to managers, because that's what we look at Nurau. We do manager training, and I wanted to ask you what you would say is the role of managers specifically in influencing the outcome of an intervention. And if you could give us an example, or there's a case study that you have looked at where you looked at, the role of managers in interventions.
Yeah, so I think each role, again, tradition has been to look at senior managers, that they need to support. They do, because they're the ones that can allocate the resources to make the intervention. Often we forget the line manager, and they play such a big role in making changes happen, ones that have to prioritize that things are being implemented. And they're also the ones that can make changes are being made to work policies, practices, and procedures at the unit level. A huge role. I wrote a chapter some years ago where I said, make or break an intervention, because they play such a huge role in prioritizing that are going to happen. So we kind of talk about managers at different levels, abilities. So at the senior management level, they need to prioritize on board. They need to communicate that this is something they're committed to. They need to allocate resources, financial resources, but line managers play a huge role in making on the ground floor in the teams. They're the ones that have to engage with employees about what can we do, what do we want to do differently, making sure that it's discussed in teams. So both all levels within the organization play a huge role. Manager training. What we have done in different projects, managers to ensure that they are equipped to go through the change, because they are complex. It's complex to change work practices, policies, and procedures. It's time consuming. It requires a really in-depth understanding of what the issues are, and capacity and competence to make changes. So what we've often done is to support the process. I can give you two examples. So in one example, we were working that wanted to implement teamwork because they had problems with turnover, and they thought, well, if we create a better working environment through giving people more autonomy over their jobs, how they do the job, what tasks, managing jobs at the same time as creating a better social climate, because people were working, they wanted to do that. And we said, well, wait a minute, line managers have to give away power in order for teams to take on more autonomy and more power. It was that we trained line managers in what is TISIC, what are the key principles of teamwork. We also trained them in how can you manage people who've got more autonomy over their jobs, who are more dependent on each other. And we also trained them in how they could go through the changes of handing over responsibilities and agreeing different tasks and responsibilities. So we trained them in that. And what we could see from our evaluation was that not only employee well-being, because the process was better, actually also helped managers' own well-being better equipped to make these changes. So I think that's a really positive example. But that was it was like 5 full days of training. Wow. What we've done in other projects is that we delivered a 2-3 hour workshop discussing with line use this participatory intervention to make your life as a manager better, to implement it. And what we could see in in one of the interventions that we work with, especially a few line managers, there was another line manager training course basically some of the line managers integrated the two. So the kind of action plans that were developed to improve team members' employee health and well-being were actually integrated in the training provided by the organization. So the line manager actually used that in his to develop action plans for how he wanted to do things differently. So it's again an example of multi-level interventions, that they're not separate. We need to work at different levels if we want to improve. And managers and line managers, senior managers at all the levels play a role in making sure that interventions become a success.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so important to remember, that you need multiple levels of a hierarchy in the organization to be on board. Because if you just have the senior managers, well, then you're going to have that implementation failure where the line managers aren't actually doing anything about it. But then if the line managers are on board and the senior managers aren't, well, you're not going to have enough support to actually cause that change to happen. So yeah, that's what we also are very passionate about here at Nurau, is equipping middle managers, line managers with the resources that they need to be able to affect change. So yeah, thank you so much, Karina, for just that insight into why that's helpful and why that's actually shown to be a very powerful way to do interventions. So we have come to the end of our. Oh yes, Karina. Yes. You have.
No, I just had one really good example. I think it's really important to support line managers, because we often put a lot of responsibility onto line. We need to support line managers in doing their job. So a colleague of mine did an intervention, I can understand we're about to finish, so I'll do it really shortly. The line managers were made responsible for implementing a change that met KPIs. And what happened then was that they just didn't communicate this change to their employees, suffer for themselves if they communicated this change to the employees. So they said, and we only found that out when we went and talked to employees, and we found out that this was because it went against other policies, indicators within the organization. So it's really important that we support line managers, and it's part to improve employee health and well-being is part of their job. It's part of their responsibility, and it shouldn't be within the organization.
Right. No, that was a very nice little short summary of the case study. Thanks, Karina. I do have a little announcement before we end out live today. So I've been doing these lives for a couple months, well, almost a year now, I think. But I am currently almost 35 weeks pregnant. So I'll be having a baby in July. And because of that, I'll be taking a break from our lives, and we'll be having Justin, our lovely CEO, to be continuing the conversation with our lives. So I'm just going to introduce Justin real quick. Justin, if you want to come on. Hi, Justin.
Hello, everyone.
CEO, and he'll be doing more interviews with managers in HR. Justin, do you want to introduce yourself real quick and talk about the future of LinkedIn Lives?
Well, Viv, hi, Dr. Nielsen. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have big shoes to fill. I think, when we first had the idea of doing LinkedIn Lives a year ago, we didn't really know what was planned, or what was our style, or what did we want to express to everyone who's listening to us. And I think you grew into that role so well, Vivian. I feel like I don't know what I'm going to say. How can I replace you? But I'll try my best. I think my focus is going to continue to be to interview people who are thought leaders in our space, but also interviewing managers and leaders who have been middle managers, have been frontline managers, but who became eventually maybe C-level managers and leaders as well. So I'm very excited. We have an amazing list of guests who are going to be joining us in the next coming months. So I'm looking forward to announcing them. And thank you so much, Vivian, for just building this beautiful legacy of LinkedIn Lives that I will continue to uphold, I hope, in the next coming months. And I will be doing a lot of interviews or LinkedIn Lives in French as well. Donc, pour tout le monde qui parle français, tout le monde au Québec, en France, qui nous écoute et qui nous suit, c'est vraiment, on va vraiment mettre la priorité pour faire des entrevues aussi en français. C'est le temps, bien évidemment. Donc, on va faire ça aussi. Thank you so much.
So stay tuned for our LinkedIn Lives to come in the future. And thank you so much again, Dr. Karina Nielsen, for being with us and talking about interventions and managers and the workplace and all that relates to our space and well-being. And we want to continue this work that we're currently doing with managers. And we hope that, researchers like you will continue as well the great work you're doing to help managers and the workplace in general. So thank you.
Inviting me. It was a pleasure chatting to you.